Imagine a teenager who hasn't slept in 3 days. But instead of dragging themselves into first period looking like an absolute zombie, they're just vibrating with this restless energy.
Right.
You're talking a mile a minute, pacing the hallways, and I mean, maybe they just recklessly gambled their entire month's allowance online before breakfast. As a parent or a teacher watching this unfold, what are you actually looking at?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Is it severe ADHD? Is it a trauma response? Or is it, a rare, really serious neurological condition?
And that ambiguity is just terrifying for families.
Yeah.
You see this cluster of alarming behaviors, you type those symptoms into a search engine, and, well, within 30 seconds, you're entirely convinced of the absolute worst-case scenario.
Oh, absolutely. The internet is definitely not your friend in that moment, which is why we're so glad you're joining us for this deep dive today. We are untangling what is honestly an absolute diagnostic minefield.
It really is.
To do this, we're working through a really fascinating stack of sources. On one side, we have these clinical notes detailing the incredibly complex landscape of adolescent bipolar disorder, and then on the other side, we're looking at program data from a system called MentalSpace School.
Right, which is an integrated K-12 mental health support network operating over in Georgia.
Exactly. And putting those two sources together, it gives us a really unique vantage point.
It really does. We get to look at the clinical reality of a deeply misunderstood disorder, and then immediately examine a case study of, how that reality is actually being managed on the ground inside real school walls.
And the mission for today is to basically decode the signals. We want to figure out how professionals are learning to separate normal, puberty-driven chaos from actual pathology,
Yeah.
and how schools are adapting to catch the kids who typically fall through the cracks. Because, before we can talk about how a school treats a mental health crisis, we really have to understand why that crisis is so notoriously difficult to spot in the first place.
Well, the clinical notes we're reviewing, they highlight a really fundamental problem in pediatric psychiatry. Adolescent bipolar disorder is a rare but very serious condition. Yet, it is incredibly easy to confuse with ADHD, impulsivity, or trauma responses.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is, but the reason for this confusion lies right in the biological reality of the developing adolescent brain. During puberty, the brain is undergoing this massive rewiring process.
Right.
Which means different underlying issues often produce the exact same surface-level behaviors. Information overload often makes parents and educators panic. So our goal today is to cut through that noise and give you a clear structural understanding of how this is being redefined.
Okay, let's unpack that biological reality for a second. Trying to diagnose a teenager feels like trying to read a compass in a magnetic storm.
That's a great way to put it.
A teen acting out impulsively could be ADHD or trauma or, just a bad Tuesday. How do you isolate the actual disorder? I think people hear a term like executive function thrown around a lot in relation to ADHD, but what does that actually mean when we're trying to distinguish it from a mood disorder?
This raises an important question about how these behaviors actually overlap. Think of executive function as the brain's project manager.
Okay.
It lives in the prefrontal cortex, and it's responsible for impulse control, planning, and emotional regulation. Now, in a teenager with ADHD, that project manager is chronically understaffed.
Right, so things slip through the cracks.
Exactly. That leads to high impulsivity and emotional dysregulation.
Yeah.
But now look at a teenager dealing with severe unresolved trauma. Their brain is stuck in a hypervigilant survival mode.
Like a fight or flight response.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that constant survival mode completely overrides that same project manager. They might act out aggressively or engage in really risky behavior purely as a coping mechanism.
So if I'm a parent or a teacher observing a kid in the hallway or, the living room, a sudden angry outburst or a spike in reckless behavior looks exactly the same, whether the root cause is a dopamine deficit from ADHD or a central nervous system reacting to trauma.
The symptoms basically form a Venn diagram with a massive, massive area of overlap. A standard observer just sees impulsivity, mood swings, and erratic behavior.
Wow.
If professionals evaluate a teenager by just looking at those behaviors in a vacuum, the risk of misdiagnosis is astronomical. And in mental health, an inaccurate diagnosis can be actively dangerous.
Wait, dangerous how? Like bad side effects?
Worse, treating a kid for ADHD with stimulant medication when they actually have bipolar disorder can actively throw them into a severe manic state.
Oh, wow. So you end up throwing gasoline on a fire you didn't even know was burning.
Exactly.
Which brings us to a massive shift in how the medical community actually evaluates teenagers. Because of this exact confusion, the psychiatric field had to fundamentally change how they do things. Over the last decade, they had to actively step back and become much more conservative.
He really did.
The clinical notes show they realized they couldn't just use chronic irritability as the benchmark for adolescent bipolar disorder anymore.
Right, they had to abandon it because chronic irritability just completely lacks diagnostic specificity.
It's too vague.
Way too vague. If a teenager is baseline grumpy, quick to anger, and easily frustrated day in and day out for 6 months, I mean, that could be a symptom of almost anything.
Yeah, that just sounds like being 14.
Exactly. It could be a chaotic home environment, mild depression, or just the hormonal soup of being a teenager. When psychiatry based a bipolar diagnosis on constant irritability, they cast the net way too wide. They were catching every moody teenager and slapping a heavy neurological label on them.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The medical field had to actively step back and be more conservative. I understand the need for a sharper diagnostic scalpel, but let me put myself in the shoes of a parent in crisis for a second.
Sure.
The new criteria professionals use waiting to observe what the notes call a 3 to 7 day discrete episode. That sounds like an exhausting, potentially really dangerous waiting game for a family. Why is chronic irritability no longer enough to just make a call and get a kid some help?
It definitely feels counterintuitive to wait, I get that. But that discrete window is literally the only way to isolate the actual mechanism of bipolar disorder. The word discrete is the absolute linchpin here.
Discrete meaning like highly specific.
Right. Clinicians aren't looking for a kid who is just always irritable. They're looking for a highly distinct, clearly defined period of time, specifically 3 to 7 days, sometimes more, where there is a radical functional change from that teenager's normal baseline.
So paint a picture of the mechanics of those 3 to 7 days. What is happening in a teenager's brain during that specific window that separates it from just a standard, highly emotional week?
Well, during a discrete episode, the brain's energy regulation center essentially breaks its own thermostat.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
You see a clearly elevated mood or this unusual buzzing energy paired with very specific biological markers. And the most prominent one is a drastically decreased need for sleep.
Right.
We aren't talking about insomnia here. We're talking about a teenager who sleeps for, 2 hours or maybe not at all and wakes up entirely wired.
Let's linger on the sleep distinction for a second because teenagers are famous for having terrible sleep hygiene. I mean, they stay up until 3 a.m. scrolling on their phones and then drag themselves to school. How does a clinician actually tell the difference between a kid glued to TikTok and a kid in a manic episode?
It comes down to the aftermath.
Yeah.
A typical teenager stays up late because they are distracted, but the biological mechanism of exhaustion is still fully functioning.
Right. They're tired the next day.
Exactly. The next day, they are dragging. They're falling asleep in algebra.
Yeah.
But in a discrete bipolar episode, the biological need for sleep just vanishes. The teenager is functioning at 150% speed, but without any breaks whatsoever.
Wow.
They have racing thoughts. Their speech might be pressured, meaning it's rapid, loud, and really hard to interrupt. And they engage in highly risky behaviors because their impulse control is severely compromised by this artificial neurological high.
And the other side of this neurological coin is the crash, right?
Always.
The clinical notes emphasize that these 3 to 7 day spikes of extreme wired energy are almost always followed by deep depressive episodes. So it's that cyclical nature, the intense, discrete spike, followed by the deep crash that clinicians are hunting for.
Yes.
Along with checking if there's a family history of bipolar disorder.
Correct.
Yeah.
That cyclical history, along with the family genetics, is the true fingerprint of the disorder. But recognizing that fingerprint introduces a massive logistical hurdle.
Because of the timeline.
Exactly. Diagnosing a 7-day discrete episode is practically impossible under the traditional pediatric psychiatric model.
Because taking a kid to a psychiatrist for a 45-minute appointment on a Tuesday is essentially just taking a single snapshot.
Right.
The doctor might see a teenager who is a little quiet or maybe a little fidgety, but they aren't seeing the whole 7-day movie. They miss the manic spike on Saturday night and the depressive crash on Thursday morning.
Which means the traditional clinic visit is geographically and logistically flawed for capturing this specific disorder. You simply cannot effectively monitor a 3 to 7 day functional change without continuous observation in the environment where the teenager spends the majority of their waking hours.
And that realization right there is driving a major legislative and structural shift.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the second half of our source stack, the program data from MentalSpace School. Taking a kid to a clinic is a snapshot, but integrating a mental health team inside a school ecosystem. It's like hooking the student up to a continuous heart monitor. You actually catch the 7-day spike when it happens. So what does this all mean? It's like installing an emotional ER right next to the principal's office.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, looking at MentalSpace School as a case study reveals how states are actively trying to solve this observational gap. They're a K-12 mental health support system operating in Georgia.
Right.
And Georgia didn't just wake up and decide to do this for fun.
Yeah.
Schools were drowning in behavioral issues that were at their core unmanaged medical crises. And this urgency led to the state's HB 268 mandate.
Let's clarify what that mandate actually is for a second. Georgia's HB 268 is a piece of legislation with a really fast approaching deadline of July 2026. It puts serious legislative pressure on schools to ensure they have robust, compliant mental health safety nets in place.
Right.
They can't just expel their way out of behavioral health crises anymore.
The mandate forces a structural change. MentalSpace School operates by coordinating directly with psychiatric prescribers for integrated K-12 evaluation and care. So instead of forcing a working parent to navigate a fragmented healthcare system, taking time off work, finding an in-network doctor, waiting 6 months for an appointment, the support is baked directly into the daily educational environment.
The level of integration detailed in the data is honestly comprehensive. They provide dedicated therapist teams per school, same-day teletherapy, crisis intervention, and suicide and violence prevention.
It's massive.
And the program ensures everything is fully HIPAA and FERPA compliant. Now, you hear those acronyms and immediately think of a mountain of red tape, but what does that mean in practice?
Well, basically, HIPAA protects a patient's medical secrets, while FERPA is the educational equivalent that protects a student's academic records. Combining them in a compliant way means the school therapist can actually communicate with the student's external pediatrician or a psychiatric prescriber without violating the family's privacy.
Oh, that's crucial.
It creates a seamless flow of data.
Another detail in their model that caught my eye is the emphasis on utilizing licensed, diverse, culturally competent therapists. Now, cultural competency is a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot in corporate HR training.
Sure.
But I want to look at the mechanism of how that actually prevents a diagnostic failure in an adolescent bipolar case.
It's absolutely vital when you consider how behavior is interpreted. Let's say you have a teenager from a specific cultural background who is suddenly speaking very rapidly, loudly, and just aggressively pacing a classroom.
Okay.
A standard clinician, acting on unconscious cultural biases, might view that simply as a behavioral or disciplinary issue. They might label the student as oppositional defiant.
Right, just a bad kid acting out.
Exactly. But a culturally competent therapist who actually understands the baseline norms of that student's community and family recognizes that this behavior is a severe deviation from the norm. They don't see a disciplinary issue, they see pressured speech, which, as we mentioned, is a hallmark biological marker of mania.
Wow. That distinction literally alters the entire trajectory of a child's life.
It really does.
Yeah.
Recognizing the medical nature of the behavior prevents the student from being funneled into the punitive disciplinary system and instead routes them directly into clinical care. Furthermore, having a culturally competent therapist inside the school ecosystem removes the friction of a family trying to find an external psychiatrist who understands their specific background.
That makes total sense.
If a family feels alienated by the person asking the questions, they simply won't share the nuanced history of mood cycling that is so critical to making an accurate diagnosis.
The environment has to foster immediate trust. And speaking of the family, MentalSpace School's data shows they also offer staff wellness programs and family counseling, which is incredible because they are treating the ecosystem the child lives in, not just the isolated student, a 360-degree safety net.
Because a teenager going through a severe manic or depressive episode creates an incredible strain on a household and a classroom. A teacher dealing with the fallout needs support to manage the room. And a family trying to survive that 3 to 7 day cycle at home, they need counseling to understand what is happening biologically and how to keep their child safe. You have to stabilize the environment to stabilize the child.
So we're looking at a world-class infrastructure here. You have diverse therapists, same-day teletherapy, continuous observation, prescriber coordination, and it's all legally compliant under this upcoming HB 268 mandate. But I want to inject a bit of skepticism here for a moment.
Let's hear it.
A world-class in-school mental health system only works if families can actually afford to use it and if they know when to use it.
Yes. Access and cost are the ultimate roadblocks.
Yep.
You can build the most advanced clinical system in the world, but if a massive financial wall sits in front of it, it's completely useless to the kids who need it most.
Let's start with the knowing when to use it part. The sources mention that MentalSpace School offers a free, family-friendly bipolar screener at cheektherapy.com mental health tests. What stands out to me is that this screener only takes 2 to 3 minutes to complete. Now, wait a minute. We just spent 15 minutes discussing how adolescent bipolar is this diagnostic minefield that requires 7 days of intense observation. How on earth can a 3-minute web screener do anything but create more false alarms? That is a massive shortcut.
That's a really crucial distinction to make. The 2 to 3 minute screener is not a diagnostic tool, it is a triage tool.
Oh, okay.
Parents are often entirely overwhelmed by the overlapping symptoms of ADHD, trauma, and mood disorders. They just don't know if they should be calling a disciplinarian or a doctor.
So the screener acts like a vital signs check for mood cycling before a parent even has to navigate the healthcare system.
Exactly. The screener is designed to quickly surface a historical pattern of mood cycling. It asks targeted questions about those discrete 3 to 7 day episodes of reduced sleep and racing thoughts we discussed earlier.
Right.
It doesn't give a diagnosis. It empowers the parent with enough data to say, hey, there is a systemic pattern here, before they step foot in a clinic or reach out to the school therapist.
Okay, so the parent takes the triage screener, the data suggests a larger pattern of mood cycling, and they connect with the MentalSpace team at their school. What happens when the bill comes? Normally, pediatric psychiatry is prohibitively expensive, which is why so many families just suffer in silence.
This is where we see the model attempting to dismantle those systemic barriers. The insurance coverage integrated into the program is incredibly broad. They accept BCBS, Cigna, Aetna, UHC, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, and Amerigroup.
That covers a huge swath of privately insured families. But what about the most vulnerable populations? How does this model address families who have, absolutely no disposable income for copays?
Crucially, for families on Medicaid, the out-of-pocket cost is $0.
Wait, really? I want to look at that critically because taking the cost down to zero for Medicaid families is a massive promise. Who is footing the bill for that? How does a program fund $0 out-of-pocket care?
Well, the funding isn't magic. It's a structural realignment. The state and federal healthcare apparatus already subsidizes Medicaid care. The historical failure wasn't always a lack of funds. It was a failure of the delivery mechanism.
Yep. Money was there, but getting it to the patient was a nightmare.
Exactly. By placing the clinicians directly inside the school and handling the billing on the back end, MentalSpace School removes the logistical friction. The state pays for the care it has mandated, and the family is shielded from the administrative and financial burden.
Removing that friction seems to yield some dramatic secondary outcomes. Looking at the program data, MentalSpace School reports an 89% improved attendance rate among participating students.
Yeah.
An 89% improvement in attendance is unusually high for a purely mental health intervention. What is actually driving that statistic? Is it the therapy itself, or just the fact that these kids are no longer being repeatedly suspended for untreated medical episodes?
What's fascinating here is the 89% improved attendance is really a combination of both. When a student is suffering from an unmanaged 7-day manic episode or severe trauma, their sleep is destroyed, their anxiety is peaking, and the absolute last place they can function is in a rigid, quiet classroom environment.
Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster.
Absenteeism isn't always truancy. It is often a secondary symptom of a mental health crisis.
Or a symptom of a school pushing a kid out because they simply don't have the tools to handle the behavior.
Precisely. By treating the crisis directly within the school walls, you mitigate both the biological inability to attend class and the punitive suspensions that keep the kid at home. The data also shows a 92% reduced anxiety rate among students utilizing the service.
That's huge.
And an 85% family satisfaction rate. When mental health barriers and financial barriers like that $0 Medicaid cost are removed, the secondary outcome is that teens actually stay in school and family satisfaction stabilizes. When you stabilize the student's neurological baseline, the entire ecosystem, the classroom, and the living room just calms down.
For any educators or parents in Georgia who are looking down the barrel of that July 2026 HB 268 deadline and wondering how to actually build this infrastructure, they can explore this case study directly. The contact information in our sources is mentalspaceschool.com or via email at mentalspaceschool@cheektherapy.com. It's a fascinating look at the logistical realities of shifting pediatric care.
It represents a much-needed paradigm shift. We are slowly moving away from a model that isolates families. forcing them to act as the sole project managers of a complex psychiatric condition.
Right.
And we're moving toward a model where the community, specifically the school, holds the safety net.
Let's do a quick recap of the ground we've covered today. We started by looking at the confusing biological Venn diagram of teenage moodiness, unpacking why a developing brain can make severe trauma and ADHD mimic a rare disorder.
Yeah.
We examined why the psychiatric community threw out chronic irritability in favor of hunting for that strict, conservative 3 to 7 day discrete episode characterized by racing thoughts and a sudden lack of need for sleep.
And then we transition into the structural solution, using MentalSpace School in Georgia as a case study for how legislative mandates like HB 268 are forcing schools to evolve from mere observational spaces into integrated healthcare hubs, complete with culturally competent therapists and $0 out-of-pocket care for vulnerable Medicaid families.
It's really a journey from understanding the microscopic neurological misfires to examining the macro legislative solutions. Before we sign off, what is the lingering thought we should take away from all of this data?
Well, the shift in psychiatric criteria offers a really profound lesson in how we perceive behavior. If the ultimate key to unlocking a life-saving bipolar diagnosis is spotting a discrete 3 to 7 day cycle, rather than just reacting to chronic irritability, how might our everyday reaction to a teenager's bad week fundamentally change? If we stopped viewing sudden erratic behavior as a personal flaw or a disciplinary failure, and instead viewed it as a vital medical timeline, we might catch the kids who are falling through the cracks long before they hit the ground.
That is a really powerful lens to view this through, changing our perspective from immediate judgment to empathetic observation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the big questions, keep observing the world around you, and we will catch you next time.